Reynolds, executive producer of community engagement at KUOW. Thanks for joining KUOW and our partner, the University of Washington Alumni Association, for our election preview, formerly known as our presidential debate preview. But as you know, tonight's debate has been canceled. Instead, President Trump and Joe Biden will be holding simultaneous town hall broadcasts coming up at 5 p.m. Pacific. So we're pivoting to an election preview, and we'd love to hear from you during this discussion. Please share your questions with us in the comments section. I'll be monitoring the questions as they come in, and I'll include them in our discussion. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. And I'm very excited to talk to our two guests today. Crystal Hall, Associate Professor of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington Evans School. One focus of her work has been decision-making behavioral research on voters. And also with us, Sally Jewell, former U.S. Secretary of the Interior, former Chief Executive Officer for REA, the outdoor gear company. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Great to be here, and it's REI, by the way, Ross.
What did I say?
REA.
REI, of course, I've been there. Just to start, maybe we could geolocate ourselves. I'm here in downtown Ballard. Can you give us an approximate location, Crystal?
I'm in Madrona.
And Sally, where are you about today?
I'm on the disconnected peninsula of West Seattle.
Oh, no. That's a whole other discussion. Crystal, I wanted to start with you because you've been studying decision-making among voters. And if the polls are accurate, Donald Trump has to get more voters to decide to vote for him. Any thoughts on how he can do that?
Yeah, so I think one assumption we make there is that the polls are accurate. And I think as we've learned over the last couple elections, we can't always fully trust what we see in the polls. But I think if we do assume that they're accurate, I think what Trump really needs to do, it's less about convincing people to vote for him and pulling people to his side than it is he needs to convince people to vote, period. And I think this is something that I think we could argue is true for both sides. But I think for Trump in particular, looking like he's potentially behind, he needs to get turnout on his side. And I think, if we look at this situation that we're in now, where instead of having a debate, we're now having two competing events. And I think as I think many of us have joked about the last debate, we could have called that potentially just two side-by-side competing events. But I think the fact that he is focusing on speaking to his base says a lot about what he needs to do. He needs to convince those folks to turn out and less so about convincing people to decide to vote for him.
That's so interesting because he's spent a lot of time trying to convince people that mail-in voting is a bad idea. I'm wondering if he's shooting himself in the foot by that recommendation, by saying that continually, discouraging his own voters from voting, if you say that's kind of a key to him right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a separate issue that I think does relate to this around just access to voting and who has access to voting and how easy it is for people to vote. And so I think, if I were advising either team, I think they need to be paying attention to how easy it will be for people to vote and what type of access people will have. And so I think, for Trump, he is potentially setting himself up to argue, as I think we all know, that there were potential, fraud and other types of issues coming up with voting. But essentially, he just needs to get people to turn out. And I think this strategy of arguing that mail-in voting is less secure is a strategy that is setting him up for what he may do depending on the results.
Crystal, I'm really interested in this research you've done on how income levels affect decisions at the polls. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the conclusions of your work and how they might apply to the upcoming presidential election.
Yeah, so there's a lot, I think, both coming from my work and other research in the field of social psychology that has talked about how income levels seem to be related to decision-making more broadly. And I think one big takeaway that comes from this field in general is that poverty and people experiencing poverty creates what we often call scarcity for decision making. And so people that are experiencing, whether it's poverty that has to do with money or poverty that has to do with time, that seems to have an impact on decision making. And often we have a perspective, the general perspective is about people that may be lower income, potentially making poor decisions, where we can flip that around, and we can actually argue that giving anyone some type of poverty, taking away cognitive resources, can lead to different types of decision making, and often what we might describe as suboptimal decision making. And I think right now we're living in a time where so many of us are experiencing scarcity of many types. We're living in a very emotional, scary time. And we know that, much of what's going on is having a disproportionate impact on the marginalized, whether that has to do with poverty, that also has to do with race and racism. And so I think this is a time when there's a lot of challenge to get people to follow through with certain types of decision making, and to engage in ways that they want to. And so what we often talk about in the psychological literature is that people's intentions and their actions don't always match up. And that can be due to a lack of resources. And so one strategy has been, getting people to commit to potentially voting early and commit to, mailing in ballots. And I think for the Trump campaign, that potentially disadvantages him. And I think that they're aware of the fact that, if more people are voting by mail and are voting early, that may have an advantage to the other side. I think that remains to be seen. I think in a lot of ways, this situation is truly unprecedented. So we'll see how that plays out.
Well, that notion of the scarcity of decision making I find really interesting, because on the one hand, you might assume that people in lower income brackets are busier than ever, given that a lot of their jobs are still necessity jobs and they're still working really hard. Then on the other hand, you also have the entire Black Lives Matter movement, which is pulling people in a political direction that I would assume would be pulling them towards voting and towards making a decision. What do you think? How do you think those two factors will play into the current moment?
Yeah, I think you're exactly what you're saying. There's potential for both sides there, right? People are stressed out. We don't know what will happen when people go to the polls on election day. We don't know if people, we have these often nightmare scenarios of people waiting in line for 12 hours to vote. And I think in the middle of a pandemic, that's even scarier for people. At the same time, we are experiencing this other reckoning that's happening, and it can serve the purpose of engaging folks. And so I think it's hard to say how it will play out. I think if I'm on the side of Trump, that makes me want to sow doubt into the whole process, to potentially, encourage folks on his side to come out and do the other on the opposite side. But it's hard to tell which one of those forces will win out ultimately. I do think that if I'm on the Biden side, I really want to encourage any kind of supports that will make it easier for people to come out and vote. Because I think that, in some of these states that we know will matter a lot, people being able to go out and safely and easily vote will make an enormous difference.
Sally Jewell, before we get to your perspective as a former Secretary of the Interior, I'd like to get to your thoughts as a business leader at REI. One of the areas of public opinion that President Trump leads on is the economy. And I'm wondering how you evaluate the Trump years when it comes to handling the economy.
Yeah, well, I did run REI, but for 20 years I was a banker. And even before that, I was an engineer in natural resources working for an oil company. So I've been in business most of my career and seen economic ups and downs. And, I think that it's fair to say that the Trump administration inherited tremendous momentum, right? I remember running REI through the Great Recession, when our sales plummeted 20% through the holiday season of 2008, and we laid off 900 people in February of 2009. That was really, really hard on everyone. And we had an economy that we thought could be heading into the next Great Depression. So it was a very, very scary time. And so what happened? Well, the Obama administration and just a little bit at the end of the Bush administration worked hard to address that with Troubled Asset Relief Fund, the bailout for banks, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and those gradually recovered the economy. And the momentum had been on an upswing through most of those years. And that's what it was like when Trump took over. And what's frustrating, I think, is, when you're doing well, you should be socking money aside, right, for when things don't go so well. And the frustration I have with the credit people give Trump for the economy is, instead of, adjusting, trying to bank some money, right, and keep some tools in the toolbox, he cuts taxes, drives up the deficit, which makes it even more expensive at some point to borrow in the future when you do have a rainy day. And clearly we have that right now. And, drives up our national debt. And I look at that as maybe a short-term economic gain for a few people. And it did really impact those that own stock and those at the higher end of the wealth scale and corporations, which got a significant tax break. But they did it really on the backs of the generations that are going to inherit our national debt. And so, as a banker, I've seen business owners like him who love debt. They love being over leveraged. I will resist the urge to suggest some other things about his business acumen, but I would say that there's a reason that many of the banks in New York didn't want to do business with him. And I think that he has damaged our reputation around the world in terms of our credit worthiness. And, if we didn't have the reserve currency that the world relies upon, I think it would be much more difficult. So I'm not a fan of his running of the economy. And I don't think many businesses are, because businesses want certainty. And he's introduced a lot of uncertainty in terms of our future.
And yet, public opinion suggests that people trust him more on the economy than they trust Joe Biden. Why could that be, Sally Jewell? What do you think? What's going on here?
I think that the economy is complicated and difficult to understand. And I think that, the measures that people look at, and certainly the measures that the president with the biggest microphone in the country uses over and over again, are the stock market. But, when interest rates are close to zero, where else are you going to put your money? So he's getting credit for some things that really there's a lot of other factors that are influencing, not the least of which, it's like, you want to put it in real estate? Are you going to put it in bonds? Are you going to put it in treasuries? Are you going to put it in a CD and get, a whopping sum of maybe 0.1%? So that drives the stock market up too, but he's taking credit for that. And I think he is a very effective user of the media to make a point that makes him look better. And that's, and I think that's why people think he's done a nice job.
If you've got a question, please weigh in the comment section here. We're reading them and we're sending them on to our guests. Rye on YouTube asks, do you think another federal stimulus package bill will be passed before the election? And if it does, do you think that would have any implications on voter support for either candidate? It looks kind of unlikely, right? I think we can say that it's been going back and forth, but what if, Sally, Crystal, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think it's going to happen before the election because of the toing and froing. But even if it did, the way people are voting early, I think it would have little outcome on the election. And I think there's little disagreement that something needs to be done frankly, on both sides of the aisle, and certainly coming from the Federal Reserve, which I think is an honest broker to the extent that, there aren't any in this process. And so I think we need it, but I am not optimistic that it will happen before the election. And I think even if it did happen before the election, I don't think it would influence the outcome. But Crystal, you're more of the expert on this.
Yeah, I agree. I also think it doesn't change people's minds at this point. That doesn't seem like the type of initiative that would actually cause people to suddenly go one way or the other, or potentially change their likelihood to vote. So I agree. I don't see it having a major impact.
The COVID crisis would try any president trying to prevent damage to the economy. But I'm wondering, Sally Jewell, what do you think of the measures that Donald Trump has taken since then? He was certainly part of the first stimulus package that poured a lot of money into the economy. What do you think about what he's done since March?
I think it's been an unmitigated disaster for the United States. And I say that because what you need at a time of crisis is calm and clear leadership, and you need shared facts, and you need leadership in guiding the support. And that is not what we've had. And, you know, one of the things that I was not familiar with when I went into government service was the amount of effort the US federal government spends on continuity of government and analyzing different scenarios and preparing public servants to respond in the case of an emergency. And that might be a terrorist attack, it might be a massive natural disaster, but also, and we did drill on this, a global pandemic. And immediately, as we did our drills, we ran out of personal protective equipment. And we changed how we funded our emergency stockpiles and supported the emergency stockpiles as a result of that. And of course, some of that was tried and tested with the Ebola outbreak, and how the US government was very engaged, even going to the source and the source countries and helping out in Africa, but also with the Zika virus and trying to prevent that from spreading. And I guess what frustrates me the most is we had a joint meeting between the Obama cabinet and the incoming nominees for the Trump cabinet, January of 2017, to just lay out not just the global pandemic but also like terrorist attacks and what are the responsibilities of your department. So it's not like there wasn't a roadmap. So it's really, really frustrating that science has been undermined, that the response has been to, you know, kind of point fingers everywhere except at leadership in the federal government. And this is exactly the kind of situation where you really want centralized control and, you know, kind of a strike team approach. And we just didn't have it. So it's an embarrassment, and our numbers show it.
Crystal Hall, there are some voters who are still undecided or not leaning one way or the other between Biden and Trump. With such strong differences between the two candidates, do you have any insight into what goes on in the minds of undecided voters when there seems like a real clear difference?
Yeah, it's so hard to say, especially in a situation like this where it does feel like we have two candidates that are just so different. I think on some level, to me, that seems to reflect a lack of trust in the political system at large. And these are folks that are potentially, I would imagine, also deciding whether they want to engage in the first place. And so I think for someone that's truly undecided, that seems like that is potentially a part of what's going on. We know that, you know, typically, right, people these days are less likely to use ideological labels to self-define themselves compared to 50 years ago. So people are less likely to call themselves liberal, conservative, moderate, kind of as a self-identity, but they do use parties to define themselves very strongly. So people identify as a Democrat versus a Republican. And we know that that identification tends to be stable over the course of someone's lifetime. And I would imagine that for undecided voters, that these are folks that have just probably over the course of their lifetimes not strongly identified one way or the other. And the mess that we see ourselves in now probably makes it even harder for them to want to jump into it. We know that, you know, for a lot of folks, and I think this feels especially true of Trump voters, political identity and politics is a place where people can find social belonging. And if someone doesn't identify strongly with either side, and potentially, you know, with Trump also, which is part of why he may have been so successful, it probably feels like a big hurdle to want to step into that camp if you're not finding that as a place of social belonging already.
You've taken a look at decision making among voters, and I'm sure this is different for every voter, but what is important to different voters? Do people really look at the issues that much? Do they look at just how the candidate comes across? Do they think of the candidate's personality? Do you have any insight into that, particularly in the folks that you looked at, low income folks? What influences them when it comes to picking a candidate?
Well, with respect to voting, I think there don't seem to be that many differences necessarily between the processes that go on, but between low income voters and other types of voters. We all like to think that we care about policies and we care about these types of ideas, but research has actually shown that often people make decisions based on political parties more than they do the actual content of what those parties support. And so social psychologists have called this the party over policy effect, where I can frame a particular policy of various types, and people may believe that they believe in one policy over the other. But if a policy that they favor is supported by a candidate and a party that they don't identify with, they are much less likely to support that policy than the other way around. And this happens with both parties. This has been shown with people that identify as Democrats and as Republicans. And so I think while we like to believe that we have these fundamental beliefs, research, especially recent research, has really shown that we tend to go along with the political parties that we've been aligned with historically.
If you've got questions for our guests, Crystal Hall and Sally Jewell, just go into the comment section and write it out, and we'll get those questions to them to try to answer. Sally Jewell, both candidates are on the record on many environmental issues. What issues do you, as former Interior Secretary and also a board member of the Nature Conservancy, see as particularly critical?
Yeah, number one, I would say, is climate change. I mean, we have got to get on with it. We've got to get back into the Paris Climate Accord. We've got to rejoin the world community. No one country can solve climate change alone. And this is, if there was a team sport that was really important to play together on, it is climate change. So tangible, measurable standards, sharing information, using sound science, building on each other's data, that's exactly what needs to happen. I would also say that we need to reinstate important regulations that and policies that were put in place to address this. So get back in the Paris Climate Accord. The Clean Power Plan. As a business person, businesses want certainty. They don't mind playing by the rules. They just can't take the rules changing all the time. So there's a lot of things that were put in place that utilities and power plants were beginning to deal with, called the Clean Power Plan, that Trump then reversed. But what do? You're in the middle of an investment to comply. So there is some compliance, but let's put those things in place so that the good actors who are doing right by the environment are recognized and rewarded for that, as opposed to, in essence, creating an unlevel playing field where the polluters can continue to do what they're doing. And there's a number of regulations that were put in place that are thoughtful regulations that actually achieve good climate outcomes or environmental outcomes, and also level the playing field so that good actors are rewarded. So there's a number of those. I'd also say that one of the things that is gaining momentum, and people are beginning to hear the term 30 by 30. So that is 30% of the lands and waters of the world put in some form of protection by 2030. And that is critically important for biodiversity and reversing the extinction crisis that we have going on. The rate of extinctions right now is about 1,000 times what it has been historically in terms of how fast it's happening. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a worldwide UN-sanctioned entity, has been working on this, engaging scientists and indigenous communities in identifying those lands and those waters that are critical for protection, and then initiating the actions to do that. It may be in private hands, it may be in tribal hands, it may be in government hands, but how do we identify that and again create incentives to protect those areas? And then, let's be sensible about kind of the playing field as it is now. I know from my time in Interior, there's about 30 different rules and regulations that favor fossil fuels over other forms of energy. Let's just get rid of those subsidies. like intangible drilling costs that allow people that drill oil wells to not depreciate those assets, but to take that as an expense in year one, even though that asset may be on the books for 50 years. There's a lot more where that came from. So let's level the playing field, and you would see a resurgence or a surge in a number of other forms of energy, and you would unlock innovation just like mileage standards in cars has done in the auto industry. So there's more. I'd love to see a price on carbon. Neither candidate's really talked about that yet, but there's a lot that we need to do, and we need to do it fast.
Yeah, I wonder if you could sketch out, you talked about the three ones, 30 by 30, of course, climate change, stop subsidizing some of the energy industry things. And when you look at the two candidates on these issues, how do they stack up?
Well, I think the Trump administration's platform has been abundantly clear. It's about energy dominance. They've used that term over and over again. And my immediate successor, Ryan Zinke, used that phrase in the relatively brief time that he was in the chair before turning it over to Secretary Bernhardt. Bernhardt comes from a background lobbying for the oil and gas industry and mining interests, as well as water interests. And the person he put as head of the Bureau of Land Management, William Perry Pendley, also comes from same background, same region, supporting fossil fuels. So, you know, their policies have been around exploitation of public lands for extractive industries. It's just abundantly clear. And they've made it very explicit. Biden is not against some mineral development. I mean, we all rely on minerals for so many things, and we are dependent for some time on fossil fuels, and we're the largest producer of oil and gas in the world. So there's momentum there, and there's people's jobs and livelihoods and regions that are dependent on that. And, you know, I think Vice President Biden understands that, but he knows that that is not sustainable with addressing climate change. And unlike even President Obama, Biden is running on a climate change platform. And we know a lot more than we did back in 2012 and even before that, or at least the general public knows more. So I think he will make thoughtful policies that are good for the environment and begin to migrate us into a direction where we can begin to not just bring down our fossil fuel consumption and our carbon emissions, but actually sequester carbon and create incentives for technologies and offsets and so on to really begin to address this long term. Because we can't even just stop putting carbon in the atmosphere. We actually have to start taking carbon out. And I think that there are some pretty interesting things that Vice President Biden has in his policy platforms to do that. But you know, it's going to take all hands on deck, and it's going to take thoughtful policies and a level playing field that gets business and the private sector and other countries playing well together to get there.
Trump has, and for that matter, Pence have tried to portray the Biden ticket as stopping fracking, the process by which natural gas is released, which has a lot of deleterious environmental impacts. When it comes to that, we see the vice president not refusing to go there. In fact, adamantly denying he's going to stop fracking from going on. As a former Interior Secretary, what do you think of that?
Well, I'm not anti-fracking. And I can tell you for governors, Republican and Democratic governors, I've sketched out a lot of back a napkin wells and fracking to explain what it is. I mean, hydraulic fracturing has been around for 60 years. And if you were to go to my confirmation hearing, somebody said, well, what would you do about fracking? And I said, well, the last time I fracked a well, which kind of was surprising everybody, but I have in fact done it. But the fact is that it has unlocked shale for natural gas and for oil. And that is why the United States has reduced its dependence on foreign oil. But forgetting that for a minute, what it has done is enabled reservoirs to be drained horizontally using directional drilling and using hydraulic fracturing from a much smaller footprint on the landscape. The downside is it uses enormous amounts of fresh water, which is a huge problem in some parts of the country like West Texas and New Mexico. They could be using produced water. It's just more expensive. So, there's thoughtful regulations that could drive that. There are chemicals that are used and they need to disclose that. And then how do they manage the flowback fluids? And they need to be able to dispose of those, or better yet, recycle them so the same water is used over and over. So those are the fracking regulations we put in place. If a bird flies over a pond of frack fluid that's sitting there, it will, there's a high probability it will die, right? That's not okay. So it has to be regulated. But I'm not against it. It is an important way to bridge us to a no fossil fuel future. And what is frustrating with the current administration is that those thoughtful rules were undone. So I think this is why Mr. Biden is, really careful to not come out against it, because it is actually gives us a chance to bridge to a different future without being dependent on foreign countries and the complexities that come with that. Plus, it is a job creator in this period of time until we can bridge people to another career. And I think that is something that Vice President Biden's talked a lot about, is the importance of jobs.
And not opposing fracking seems to be particularly important in the swing state of Pennsylvania also.
It's Pennsylvania, it's New Mexico, it's the Dakotas. It's in states that are probably very low probability of going for Mr. Biden. And it is, Florida's not a big fan of fracking or oil and gas. And so that could be one of the reasons, but I don't think it's the only reason. I think he actually understands that this is not a simple thing. And it's also something that I think that some people rally around. It's sort of a lightning rod issue, but like everything, it's more complex than what meets the eye.
We have a great couple of guests this evening. If you have questions for them, go to the comments section and ask them. Sally Jewell, former Interior Secretary, former business person, worked in banking for many years. And also Crystal Hall, who is a political scientist and has done research into how people make decisions when it comes to politics. Amy on YouTube had this question for you, Secretary Jewell. How can we get the business community to sign on to support climate policies? And I'll just interject that there are some in the business community that are already doing that. Where do you see a gap?
Yeah, when President Trump announced he was withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, was a significant effort called We're Still In. And that was states and municipalities and many, many businesses that are devoted to that. And frankly, as you've seen a movement toward ESG, environment, social, and governance policies on major endowments and other investment arms, businesses ignore climate change and in the environment at their peril, and they know it. So when I was running REI, we began to do, I think the first sustainability report was 2006. And I got to tell you, we did not know what we were doing. There has been so much work done since that time, and so much shared knowledge, and leaders like Walmart has been a leader. Costco in our own backyard is a leader. Microsoft has said that it's going to not only be carbon neutral by 2030, I think it's 2030, but it's going to be by 2040, it's going to have, sort of repaid all the carbon that it had consumed over the course of its existence. I think you see more and more of that. So that's step one, is I think there's a lot of pressure that's coming from investors and outside communities to do this. The second thing is, I keep talking about thoughtful regulation. So think about mileage standards in cars. You say to the auto industry, as the Obama administration did, in its tenure, okay, for light duty cars and trucks, you need to have a certain standard. I think it was a fleet average of 55 by 2035 or something. I may get the numbers wrong. So that levels a playing field. Everybody knows where they have to play. It sets a standard that the world basically plays by, because, auto companies for the most part are multinational. And everybody competes to be able to deliver a great product and also at better consumption. That, or efficiency standards in appliances or other things, are ways that you incent businesses to innovate and are aligned with the environment. And that is on the policy side, the kind of thing that we can do that I think will drive the changes needed in business. And again, support and reward those who participate and maybe put incentives in place if they can do better, and penalize those that don't.
Amy, thanks for that question. Crystal Hall, a lot of your research on voter behavior was during the Obama administration. And it's fair to say, I think, that the Donald Trump was a backlash against aspects of the Obama administration. And I'm wondering what your research shows when it comes to that.
Yeah, I think to a large extent, we could actually argue that a lot of this was backlash against the mainstream Republican Party. He came in arguing that he was the solution to a lot of what people's perceived problems are with government at large. And I think this was really powerful, coupled with this unearthing of authoritarianism that we've seen in the United States. And so he really played to this fear of outsiders, and that fear and authoritarianism can bring this support for very strong leaders and very punitive leadership. And so I think those two things coupled together really allowed him to build this base, this foundation that carried him by tying those two things together. I think we see that, it's very hard to often have the same arguments work for both sides. We know that the foundations of what people believe makes up good decision-making and morality seems to look pretty fundamentally different for liberals versus conservatives, where for liberals, it's about fairness and equality and protecting those that are vulnerable. For conservatives, it's much more about in-group loyalty and morality and authority. And I think that the Trump campaign really played to that. And I think that allowed him, coupled with this frustration that people had with the government at large, I think that really built the base. And I think, if we look back, for some people, it could also be that, the folks that really propelled Obama was its own form of anti-establishment as well.
Crystal Hall, is there a racial component to low-income people's political views? You've done a lot of looking at decision-making amongst low-income people. Does race come into play?
I think anytime we want to understand some of these big societal questions, it's really important to take this type of intersectional approach, because we know that poverty and race and racism and gender, all of those things create very different situations and very different social contexts. I think when we look at participation in politics and people's political views, I think that a lot of those factors intersect to create different types of barriers to political engagement. And we can take voting as one of the most fundamental behaviors that people can engage in. We know that barriers to voting really look differently when you take an intersectional lens. So it's not just about lower income people living in poverty. It's not only about race and racism, and those things are all interacting together. So I do think it's critical. I don't know if fundamentally we would see real differences in people's views necessarily, but I do think that the way that those things interact to create differences in access to voting make a big difference. And I think we've seen a lot of that already playing out in looking at who, people being purged from voting rolls, and a lot of these things are disproportionately impacting certain individuals, largely Black and poor individuals.
Gail, who's watching us on YouTube, has this question for you, Dr. Hall. Are there differing factors that influence younger voters versus older voters, is her question. And I've been reading that there's a kind of many older voters are abandoning President Trump. So I'm wondering what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. I think that the strategies to reach those voters has to be very different. phone banking is much more effective for reaching older voters right now than it is for younger voters, because it's just a lot easier to reach older voters through landlines. We now see that text messaging has become a lot more popular to try to connect with voters. So I think on the outreach side, that looks different, and different, being able to get different levels of outreach changes the engagement. I think the other thing that we see now is that social media has a big impact in these spaces. And we know that, generally speaking, we all as humans suffer from motivated reasoning. So, when we're cheering for a team, right, whichever side we're on, that changes our perception of the game. What we see happening looks very different depending on where we start. And we're not all watching the same game. And there's also similar confirmation biases where we're searching for information that supports what we already believe. And I think there's more and more evidence showing that social media seems to exacerbate both of these things. And we know that younger folks are also going to be more likely to be engaging in social media. And so I think that could potentially go one way or the other. We could see that causing folks to be more deeply engaged and being motivated by a lot of the social movements that we see happening. At the same time, it may make it possible for younger voters to also tune it out if they don't want to have that input. So I think it could go one way or the other. I think it seems to be having a different impact on the strategies to reach folks.
Courtney on YouTube has a question for either of you or both of you, and it has to do with the Electoral College. She asks, will it endure or will it be dismantled? And of course, this is a really confrontational issue, since twice in the last generation, there have been elections decided not by the popular vote, but by the Electoral College. What are your thoughts on the future of the Electoral College? Is it just impossible to dislodge?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I can say anything about the future of the Electoral College. I do think it's interesting to think about moving forward. If the Electoral College does change, I think we could be in a situation where it does benefit the Democratic Party more than the Republican Party. And so the narrative now has been, and this has been the evidence as well, is that it has benefited Republicans. As the country continues to change for a wide variety of reasons, that might change. And who knows if that, how long that would potentially take. But I think it's important that we think about this as not just being a barrier for one party or the other, but potentially just a barrier towards people's individual vote, essentially kind of counting in the same way. So I don't know what that means for what will happen to it, but I do think it's good to just realize that it's not something that may always benefit one side versus the other.
Well, it seems to clearly benefit small states more than it benefits big states, to the degree you can decide who lives in those states. But Sally Jewell, any thoughts on the future of the Electoral College?
I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. Yeah. And I think that if you look at the very, very strategic efforts on the part of the Republican Party to be disproportionately represented in the state legislatures, in the governor's mansions, and even down into some of the counties and other things, they definitely have a vested interest because of the nature of kind of the blue and red rural urban divide that we have in maintaining the status quo. And because of their the dominance that they have, I mean, I don't remember the statistics, but they're out there to find on, how many voters those Republicans represent relative to the Democrats. It's far more represented by fewer Democrats than by the Republicans. And you're not going to get a change in the Electoral College until that levels out. And I mean, I got to hand it to the Republicans for playing a long game and being really strategic. And to a certain extent, that may come back to bite them. I think for the Republicans that are vocally supporting Biden at this point, they would be in that camp of, wow, we created something that is not what we wanted in our party, and how do we get that back? But I don't see it changing anytime soon. I think the barriers to changing Electoral College are really high. And I think that there's probably going to be a lot of professors looking at this whole circumstance and gerrymandering and voters' rights and all that stuff, which is going to make great fodder for your PhD students, Crystal, in the coming years.
Yeah, and I would just add, I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think to me, the issues around gerrymandering and just straight up access to voting are much more pressing issues. And I think if we can, and more pressing, and potentially just there will be more opportunities to change some of those issues.
Sally Jewell, public lands represent 30% of the nation's landmass and an additional 1.7 billion acres of the waters offshore, all public lands. How do you think Trump and Biden would differ in the oversight of federal lands and waters based on what you've seen from them in the past?
Yeah, I guess I kind of gave a glimpse into how I view this. I mean, Trump really looks, and so does Secretary Bernhardt, the current Secretary of the Interior, at public lands as a source of revenue for business to be extracted. And, with the exception of a few things, like Don Jr. went fishing in Bristol Bay. And so fortunately, it looks like they've come out against the Pebble Mine. So that's a good thing. But in general, I would say that it has been lopsided, and there has not been a focus on a more balanced approach. I think a President Biden would understand that more and be more understanding of the value of public lands for conservation, for ecosystem services, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, habitat, and that's just a very different lens through which the different administrations would look. I also will say that I think worldwide there is a growing recognition of the value of indigenous communities in overseeing the sort of the remaining hotspots for biodiversity around the world, including in parts of the United States. So I think that in a Biden administration, you would see recognition of that and increasing respect and engagement with indigenous communities on learning how to manage landscapes. And, one country that's really just, turning this up in an important way is Canada. Got a lot to learn from Canada. I'd say Brazil is kind of going in the opposite direction, unfortunately. Where's the United States going to go in this? And I think that that's also really important. In the case of waters, people don't know this, but the Department of the Interior basically leases the subsurface mineral estate for oil and gas development, and also is responsible for leasing or protecting areas of the ocean. And the protection side, that's in conjunction with NOAA, which is in the Department of Commerce. We learned lessons in the Gulf of Mexico through the oil and gas development, and many of the critical habitats that were severely impacted because we didn't pay attention to that many years ago in the development of those resources. We learned from that, and in the Obama administration stood up wind energy in the Atlantic. Okay, so how does the Atlantic, like you see in Europe, wind turbines spinning offshore in Northern Europe, how do we do that in the United States, but do it in the right ways? Okay, not fun to be a bird and try and fly through a wind farm. Okay, it impacts the maritime industry and shipping. It may impact defense. It may impact a visual landscape from somebody that loves to look out over the water and doesn't want to see flashing red lights on the top of wind turbines. We learned from the Gulf and apply to the Atlantic kind of a zoning, if you will, deconflicting areas and then leasing those areas for wind energy development. And what's interesting is the first competitive lease sale was done during the Obama years. Actually, it happened on the second term, so my 4 years, and it went for a small sum of like $1.5 million. The most recent, or one of the most recent ones done, which was in 2018, went for $450 million, or over $500 million. That industry has taken off, and it's taken off in the right ways and in the right places, recognizing environmental impacts and so on. And so I think that looking at our assets, lands and waters, in a holistic way, saying how can they help drive the economy, drive jobs, support our energy future, but do it in a way where we learn from the lessons of the past. Because if you put wind or solar in the wrong ways in the wrong places, you can end up with problems just like we have with oil and gas.
Sally, the wildfires this summer have become a huge concern here and in California and elsewhere. What do you know about what each candidate would do that could better manage these wildfires and reduce the number of wildfires in the future?
Yeah, well, I think there's several things that they can and should do. But first, what's driving the wildfires? Okay, so one element is absolutely climate change, right? It's hotter, it's drier, more extremes, and so the seasons are longer and the weather patterns are different. We've certainly seen that this year in California in a huge way. The fuel load is high. And the fuel load is high because we've suppressed fires, with the whole Smokey Bear stuff for over the years. Again, listening to indigenous communities who've used fire effectively on the landscapes, we would have done a better job if we'd listened. But the fuel load is high, and some of that is driven by we're putting money into suppressing the fires and taking it away from the budgets that are used for managing the forest. So when President Trump says, well, everybody should rake the forest, okay, well, it costs some money to rake the forest, raking the forest, let's just give him credit and say he means managing the forest effectively to reduce fuel loads. It costs money to do that. And you can't take money to put it into suppression and expect that that's just going to fall out of the sky. And then the wildland urban interface, or WUI. People are building out in areas that are fire prone. They're beautiful. Who doesn't want to live in the forest until it catches on fire? And so, I think that the departments that deal with this, the Forest Service, the Department of the Interior, and state agencies know what they need to do. It doesn't matter what party they're in. They know what needs to be done. And we had a lot of bipartisan work to say, let's treat fires as the emergencies that they are, the ones that exceed kind of your regular budget. And let's fund them out of emergency funds, like we do for hurricanes and floods and earthquakes and everything else. And then let's have a steady, predictable stream of money for forest management and look at the policies that support that. So we have had, I think, some movement in that in the Trump years, something that we tried to get done in the Obama years, which was funding more effectively. So that was improved. But we've just got so much more to do in respecting public servants and what they need and setting the budgets up for success and long-term management, and working with local municipalities and governments on zoning so that people take responsibility for where they're building, and insurance companies so that they won't insure them if they're building in the forest, and or they will insure them, but it's going to be so expensive they might build in an area that's less fire prone. All these things come together, and I think regardless of who's in there, we are just have a situation that's untenable, and I don't think it's really political. I think it is a matter of will and financial support.
I have a final question for each of you. We've been talking about what you know, but I'm very curious about what you don't know about this coming election. In 3 weeks, we're going to have the answers to a lot of questions, maybe 4 weeks, maybe 5, who knows, maybe to the end of the year. But there will be answers to a lot of the questions we've been raising here today. And particularly from you, Crystal Hall, I'd like to start with you as someone who studies public policy and the behavior of voters. What are kind of the big questions in your mind that you think we'll see answered over the next few weeks and when the election takes place and after the election?
I'm really curious to see how the polls play, how the outcomes play out compared to the polls. I think we rely so much on that data. Political campaigns rely so much on that data. And this has been such a unique election season, year, 2 years, how long we've been in this campaign. And it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out and who turns out and who doesn't turn out. And that's one of the things that I'm most interested to see is just how do things actually shape up compared to what the direction they seem to be going in, and how good have we been at trying to understand these things in advance.
And of course, pollsters got a lot of flack at the last election because they didn't assure us that it was going to be a Trump defeat and a Hillary Clinton victory, but they were leaning in that direction. Do you think they deserved all the flack that they got after the last election?
I don't think so. I think, from a statistical perspective, right, we know that a low probability event is not a zero probability event. So I think it's easy to look back and say that they got it wrong, but these things are difficult to predict, and I think we saw a lot of events and a lot of the mechanics of the campaign, and a lot of the rhetoric was just all so different that we were in uncharted territory, so to speak, and we are again now. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Sally Jewell, how about you? What are the unknown unknowns, or what are the questions that are really on your mind that you hopefully will be answered within the next few weeks?
Well, maybe not a few weeks, but maybe a few months.
Yes, let's be cautious about that.
I'm really worried about the polarization in our society. I mean, we are better than this. We are better than the camps that we're in, and the difficulty in listening to each other, and the sort of the echo chamber that Crystal referenced earlier. And what I really want to know is, can we accept the results of the election, and can we pull together as a country? And what kind of risks, are going to be out there by people that have such different points of view that have been, really driving families apart. And so I wish I knew how people would respond. And, I think there is a silver lining in this pandemic in that, you have seen people pull together. You have seen them support each other and appreciate the heroes among us doing the everyday work that we all depend on to survive, from our food to our healthcare, and so on. And so will we be able to rise better selves, or are we, in a period of such division that it could devolve into a situation where people's lives are at risk? And I think that that's not out of the realm of possibility.
I've got to go ahead.
I was just going to say, if I was at one of the town halls, if you had a town hall with both candidates, I'd love to have each of them articulate what they're going to do that is going to make future generations proud of them.
Mm. Yeah, we call that a debate. A town hall with both of them would have been a debate.
Well, we'll see if they get to that in the next debate. Thanks to both of you. It was really a pleasure to have you with us, and I really enjoyed hearing what you had to say about these issues. Crystal Hall, Associate Professor of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington Evans School, and also Sally Jewell, former U.S. Secretary of the Interior, former Chief Executive Officer for REI. Thank you both. The dueling presidential candidate town halls are going to be starting just a few minutes from now at 5 o'clock. President Trump's going to be on NBC. Joe Biden will be on ABC. And hopefully they're both going to be on the same stage for the third and final scheduled debate a week from tonight, Thursday, October 22nd. Regardless, I'll be joined by two guests to talk about either the upcoming debate or the upcoming election. They will be Leila Fernandez, director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. And we're going to welcome back former Washington State Attorney General Rob McKenna. You can register for these events and all our election-related events at kuow.org/events. If you're watching on YouTube today, also please subscribe to our channel below. And a reminder that during this busy election cycle, you'll find new KUOW and NPR stories on the KUOW Newsroom podcast. So jump in whenever you're ready to listen and skip whatever stories that you want. Take 10 minutes to get caught up on the latest news of the day with KUOW Seattle Now podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you so much for being with us virtually this evening. I look forward to seeing you in person soon. Good evening. Thanks.